Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Our next speaker, Ronald White, is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling presidential biographies, A. Lincoln, a biography, and American Ulysses, a life of Ulysses S. Grant, both published by Random House. His other books on the 16th president include Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the Second Inaugural, which was a New York Times notable book, The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words, a Los Angeles Times bestseller, and Lincoln in Private, what his most personal reflections tell us about our greatest president, which was the recipient of the 2021 Baroness Lincoln Award. He is a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary and received his PhD from Princeton University. Ronald White has taught at UCLA, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and Princeton Theological Seminary. His most recent book is On Great Fields, The Life and Unlikely Heroism of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, published by Random House in 2023. Ronald White.
Thank you, Jill, for your introduction. I arrived yesterday afternoon from California, and so many of you have already said, this is the greatest event. I've been here 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 14 years. My memory in arriving was of Gabor Borat, who founded the Civil War Institute, who invited me to teach in his classes at Gettysburg College. He's very much in my mind as I speak this afternoon. When I finished my manuscript for the book On Great Fields, I received a telephone call from Brunswick, Maine. The woman on the end of the phone, Nina Maurer, said she'd been hired as a consultant to rethink how people would view and enjoy the Chamberlain home. A remarkable home. He had moved it several blocks so that when he became president, he would face both the college and First Parish. And then he did something I thought even more unusual. He raised the first floor 11 feet so that he could put in place a new first floor. If you get an opportunity, visit that home. So after she asked me some questions, I asked her a question. I said, well, tell me, who attends or who visits the Chamberlain house? Well, she said about 60% of the people who come are great Chamberlain aficionados. They are fans. I said, yes. She said the other 40% have been wrangled in by their friends and relatives. So I've been speaking about Chamberlain across the country since October 31st, and I've found that's about the right ratio. 60% are Chamberlain fans, 40% I've been wrangled in. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir this afternoon in terms of who is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. You may be aware that as we meet, the $13 million project to redo Little Round Top is about to finally conclude. I received an update when I spoke at the Lincoln Forum in November. It's a way of trying to save, preserve, better signage, better renovation. They keep saying this, they say it'll be open in July on the moment the battlefield is remembered. $13 million to redo Little Round Top. On the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, on a back-and-forth battle on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the 20th Maine Regiment received orders to defend the far left line of the Union Army. The colonel of the 20th Maine was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, 34 years old. He stood 5 feet 10.5 inches tall, a lean build, sandy-colored hair. Oh, I better start using this, should I not? Here we go. There he is, and with what he called his ferocious mustache. His sparkling blue eyes conveyed his affection for the scholars, the soldiers that he led. And yet I suggest he was a very unlikely military hero. Mild-mannered, amiable, good-humored. He served as a professor in a small college way to the north in Maine. He was a man of deep Christian faith and remarkable intellectual curiosity. He was fluent in 9 languages. I love to say this when I speak at colleges. Let me say that one more time. He was fluent in 9 languages, who interspersed his lectures with citations or allusions to Greece and Rome and with quotations from Dante and Goethe. No one would have predicted that this learned professor would have become the hero that we are talking about today as we are here in Gettysburg. Born after 50 years after the nation's founding, he was very much caught up in the understanding of the Union. I was so pleased when I arrived today to learn that 2025 will be a tribute to Gary Gallagher. In the debate, shall I say, battle over the meaning of the Civil War, I think Gary Gallagher's work in uplifting the meaning of the Union is so absolutely important. Very controversial to some, I think absolutely central in our understanding of the meaning of the Civil War. For Chamberlain, this was not simply a political truth. This was almost a religious value. It was a transcendent truth. At Gettysburg, he needed to draw upon all of his qualities to be this likely hero. So the qualities, what were they? Well, he was idealistic, he was high-spirited, he was courageous. He could also be, shall we say, impetuous and stubborn. At Gettysburg, he used all these qualities in the Battle of Little Round Top. Yet, in the vagaries of American memory, Chamberlain, as you know, was literally forgotten in the early 20th century. Gary Gallagher helped me understand some of the guidebooks that were written in the 20s and 30s here at Gettysburg who did not mention Chamberlain at all. And yet then the Shara, Killer Angels, that became the basis of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. And then Jeff Daniels portraying Chamberlain in the movie Gettysburg. And suddenly he came back to life. But if Chamberlain was rediscovered, I think it was mostly as what I would call a zoom lens. Understandably, the lens focused almost exclusively on the Civil War. What I have determined to do is to have a wide-angle lens, to sense the larger, wider story of who this person was before Gettysburg and the remarkable story after Gettysburg. I quickly learned, however, that in writing this biography it was going to be a prickly task, for there were those then and now who want to demean Chamberlain. Did he exaggerate? Did he fabricate what he did here at Gettysburg? What he did at Appomattox? What happened at Petersburg? This became a prickly task in writing this biography. How to take into account the nay voices that were also criticizing who he was. As with my biographies of Lincoln and Grant, there are several convictions that kind of are important to me in writing a biography. First, I want to really focus on the young person's life. Ulysses S. Grant said, "I do not read biographies because they do not tell me about the boy who became the man," or we would say the girl who became the woman. And I think modern biographies often skip much too quickly over the young person's life, what I would call the formative part of a person's life. Think of your own lives, whether you're in the 40s or 60s or 80s here this afternoon. Was it not when you were 16 or 18 or 20 or 22 or 24 when the values were formed in the life? Oh, surely you're a different person today, but those values were there. So without my hardly realizing it, of the 20 chapters in biography, 5 of them are about Chamberlain's formation. The second foundation of the way I write biography is I want to lift up what I call the faith story. I think these stories have been overlooked by modern biographies. Oh, that was the 19th century. Oh, that's what people believed then and there. No, this is really important. To understand how Lincoln, in the second inaugural address, to the surprise of his audience in 701 words, would mention God 14 times, quote the Bible 4 times, and invoke prayer 3 times, when in the previous 18 addresses, the Bible had been addressed only 1 time in 18 addresses. or Ulysses S. Grant, who really is a son of Methodism, so that the first great national church ever established far before the Washington Cathedral was the Methodist National Church, and it was time to be dedicated 4 days before Grant's inauguration because he was the son of Methodism, and they wanted to lift him up. So it is the Chamberlain story. His parents are really 19th century descendants of New England Puritanism. I wanted to understand what is the faith story behind him. Finally, I'm looking for the question in all my biographies, is there something that will surprise us? Something that maybe has been passed over? Something perhaps that's been overlooked that we need to reassess and re-understand as we go forward? For me, the art of biography involves a puzzle of many pieces. The first puzzle is how to understand the beneficiary of this classical Bowdoin College education, who, when he becomes a professor, becomes a critic of this very education, both its curriculum and its teaching method. How to understand this soft-spoken college professor who becomes this risk-taking soldier at Civil War, at Gettysburg and at Petersburg. And finally, how to understand Frances Caroline Adams, Fanny. Oh, I'm forgetting my clicker. I always do that. The other part of the story at Gettysburg, as you may well know, is William Calvin Oates, and I spend quite a bit of time. He is the leader of the 15th Alabama, and the terrific contrast between these two, who both will become great leaders after the Civil War. And here's the photograph of Little Round Top on July 3rd, one day after. Chamberlain arrives at Bowdoin College in 1848. The college was established in 1808. It was a 5-day horseback ride from Maine to Harvard, and they wanted to establish a college in their own home state. Chamberlain arrives to participate in a classical education. He'd been raised in his family in the traditional Protestant education, which focused on what was called catechesis. This is something that came down from the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. He memorized 107 questions and answers of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Question 1, what is the chief end of man? Answer 1, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Sadly, we have forgotten memorization. Our children or our grandchildren, I can look it up on Google. It's been so wonderful to meet persons. I met recently a father who told me that his 6-year-old son had memorized the Gettysburg Address. When invited to speak by the State Department in Germany some years ago, at dinner in an Italian restaurant in Berlin, a German graduate student said to me, "Could I say to you Lincoln's farewell address at Springfield? I have memorized it." And so he said it to me in his second language from memory. At one moment when Chamberlain is going out to face a terrific problem and battle, he says to himself, fortified by the Westminster Confession. Memorization is not simply something we do that's rote. It gets into our heart, it gets into our mind, and at our peril we have forgotten what it means to memorize, be it the Psalms or be it poetry. Chamberlain arrives at Bowdoin College. It's a classical curriculum, just as our founders were steeped in the classical authors, the authors of Greece and Rome. And I asked myself the question, well, why would you have a classical curriculum in the middle of the 19th century, what I call a character-based education? And I was much informed by Professor Cornelius Conway Felton of Harvard, who wrote in 1848 on the value of becoming Greek. And he said the problem was a self-indulgent age that tolerated a constant reference to self. Now, is he talking about 1848 or 2024? A constant reference to self. So the way to get beyond the constant reference to self is to be imbued with the values of Greece and Rome. Chamberlain arrived at Bowdoin with a great physical disability. He was a stammerer, or he was a stutterer. When he came to the letters B, P, and T, he was stuck. And in an education that was much based on recitation, he found himself absolutely overcome with embarrassment and fright. Fortunately for him, one of his professors helped him using the analogy of the Spartans and the Athenians who sang their way through their own stuttering. And then one of the remarkable ironies of Chamberlain, he will become professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College. He also arrived at another auspicious moment. Calvin Stowe, an alumnus of the college, was hired in his third year, Chamberlain's third year, to be professor of religion. Calvin Stowe's wife was Harriet Beecher Stowe. In an epiphany one Sunday morning at First Parish, which seeks cheek to jowl to the university, the college, she had this feeling and a meaning that she had to write something about what she'd experienced with her father in Cincinnati as slaves, enslaved persons crossed the Ohio River in the Underground Railroad, perhaps going all the way to Canada. So she began to write something which she never imagined would become a book. It was first to be serialized in a magazine. She called it Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she invited some of the students to come in on a Saturday evening and listen as she read these chapters, chapter by chapter. Now, I don't want to overemphasize what this meant for Chamberlain, but if you can picture this boy in this far northern state of Maine, suddenly for the first time, I think, he is hearing this remarkable story of the absolute awful stain of slavery in our American society. Well, it was at Bowdoin College that he met Fanny, Frances Caroline Adams. Her father, her stepfather, was the pastor of First Parish. Now, her story is a 19th century story that sounds very, very unbelievable to us. She was the seventh child of a family who lived in Boston. Her father was old enough to be her grandfather, and so he and his wife decided they would give Fanny away to his younger cousin and his wife so that she would have the benefit of growing up with parents in their 20s instead of a man in his 50s. And so at age 4, she is taken to Brunswick, Maine, and becomes the stepdaughter of George Adams. Fortunately for us, for me, George Adams kept a remarkable diary in which he says so much about Fanny. Now, Fanny's a remarkable young girl and then young woman. She's very talented in both art and music. Am I skipping this? Here we go. Oop. There's Chamberlain as a student at Bowdoin College. And here's the First Parish. The spire blew off in the wind at the end of the 19th century, but it's this beautiful wooden Gothic church, just remarkable. And here is Fanny. You can almost see, I think, in her photograph, something of the perplexity of her personality. I found late in my research this remarkable story of Fanny. She's a 17-year-old high school student at Brunswick High. She's high-spirited, and listen to what takes place. Her high school assignment by her teacher, Mr. Alfred Pike, was to compose a paper using verbs ending in FY. Knowing that Pike did not entirely approve of her humor, she wrote, "This is to certify, notify, exemplify, testify, and signify my obedient disposition. And I hope that it will gratify, satisfy, beautify, and edify my teacher, and pacify, modify, and nullify his feelings of dissatisfaction toward me. Do not exclaim, 'Oh, fie,' when reading this paper." Young Fanny was smart, and she knew it. But in that diary, her stepfather often wrote, "Poor Fanny, poor Fanny." She struggled with depression. She struggled with a problem with her eyes. By the end of her life, she would be blind in both eyes. She had a struggling time. And yet she and Joshua, his parents always called him Lawrence, but we'll call him Joshua, found themselves together in love and had this remarkable relationship and a marriage that lasted almost 50 years. Then there's the surprise. At the end of his Bowdoin College years, the question was raised, what would he do now? And the parents had two completely different opinions as to what their eldest son, should do. The father, with a long descendancy of people who had fought in various wars, including the Revolutionary War, wanted him to go to West Point. You could then go to West Point after you went to college. The mother wanted him to be a minister or missionary. He decided to go to Bangor Theological Seminary. Until the early 19th century, ministers, like lawyers, almost lived with the practitioner and learned their arts. So they went to Yale or Harvard, and then they learned the arts of ministry. But starting in the 19th century, theological seminaries were founded, and one of the first was Bangor Theological Seminary. But when I read all the previous biographies of Chamberlain, only 2 sentences were delivered for 3 years at Bangor Theological Seminary. Why? Well, Chamberlain, when he graduated, had invitations to serve 2 different churches, one in Maine, one in New Hampshire. But right away, Bowdoin College said, if you come and offer an address at our commencement, we'll give you a Master of Arts degree. And evidently the address was so remarkable, they offered him the next morning a teaching component. So he never accepted those calls. But I've served as the dean of a theological seminary. I've served as a professor at several seminaries. I know many people then and now who go to theological seminaries not to become ministers, but want the benefit of a theological education. But the problem, Bangor Seminary was founded in 1814, went out of business in 2013. Where were the records? Fortunately for me, I arrived at the Maine Historical Society in Portland just as the records had been cataloged. And I devote a full chapter to this part of his formation, those 3 years at Bangor Theological Seminary. At Bangor Seminary, he studied with the August Enoch Pond. And again, one of the aha moments that one has in doing research, I found at the University of Maine in Orono, Chamberlain's 123 pages of notes from Enoch Pond's classic class on theology. Being and nature of God, the scriptures, the person of Christ, the human mind, natural and moral ability, nature of holiness. Why did Chamberlain keep 123 pages through his entire life? Well, I can't answer that question, but I can make a presumption. And at Bangor Theological Seminary, thinking he might be a missionary, he learned 2 more languages, Arabic and Syriac, now learning 9 languages. As a young professor, he dresses in quite a different way, starched collar, looking much more august as professors did in that time. When the Civil War broke out in April of 1861, Chamberlain was teaching at Bowdoin College. There were no electives in 19th century colleges, so I believe he taught every student. I spoke this morning with John Cross, the alumni secretary at Bowdoin College. His father was the alumni secretary at Bowdoin College, and John Cross has tracked every single graduate of Bowdoin College and what they did in the Civil War. And so Chamberlain would have learned very quickly of men who enlisted, who were captured, who were killed in those opening months. And as you know, the next year, Lincoln offers a proclamation saying we now need 300,000 more men. Chamberlain decides to apply. He writes a letter to the governor of Maine, and he says this: I fear this war, so costly in blood and treasure, will not cease until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice their dearest personal interests. Duty is a value of 19th century masculinity. Washburn, you know the story of political generals or political officers. Governors were looking for outstanding men who would have the ability to enroll 1,000 men in a regiment. And so he offers Chamberlain a colonelcy. You will become the colonel of the 20th Maine. Chamberlain says, no, I will take the subordinate position and learn and earn my way to the command. what that tells us about Chamberlain. 10 months after Gettysburg, he is leading a charge at Petersburg, and he's hit by a minie ball. It penetrates just below his right hip, rips through his body, severs blood vessels, scrapes his bladder and urethra, smashing his bone before stopping at the edge of his left hip. 2 doctors come upon him and tell him he will die. Modern physicians say Chamberlain had a 10% chance of survival. He tells the doctors to attend to other men who have a chance of living. Ulysses S. Grant, the word goes up. Ulysses S. Grant does something incredibly unusual. He promotes Chamberlain, he writes about this in his memoir, on the spot, so that Chamberlain, in his death, will be given the promotion to general, so that his wife and family will know of this. Well, fortunately, his younger brother Tom, also in the 20th Maine, rushes over and finds 2 other surgeons, and they come and remove the bullet. But Chamberlain then writes this remarkable letter to Fanny. Believing he is dying, he writes this letter. My darling wife, I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings, they had 2 young children, and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. Live for the children. I'm just blown away every time I read that letter. Well, he survives. He goes through 3 surgeries. Doctors tell him he won't not live long. He then has what modern scholars call the invisible wounds inside his body. You and I have been accustomed to think of the Civil War and all of the amputations, which are the outward wounds. But Chamberlain is involved with these inner wounds, which will take an incredible toll on his life, being infected again and again. Finally, 10 months later, Chamberlain is now at Appomattox. He is given the assignment to lead the surrender at Appomattox. Here's part of the prickly biography. People said, well, how could that possibly be? There's no written order, but my mentor, my teacher, Jim McPherson, said, well, not everything was written down in the last hours of the war. This is completely possible. So I decided to go to Appomattox, and I decided to speak with the park historian there who has spent 25 years examining this story. And with all the back and forth, all the criticism, all the questions, I do believe that Chamberlain led the surrender at Appomattox. And the person who was surrendering to him was John Brown Gordon. Like Chamberlain, not a West Pointer, he had risen through the ranks to be right at the top of Lee's generals. His men called him the Gallant. So I tried to imagine myself. Appomattox has taken place. Grant has offered this remarkable magnanimous peace to Lee, and now Chamberlain is offered the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. As Gordon and his men approached, think about this, 3 to 4 yards now separating the blue and gray lines. Chamberlain must have thought about what Grant had offered to Lee. He wanted to have some kind of recognition, not to the Confederacy, not to the cause, but to the courage of the Confederate soldiers. And so when they approached him, he switched his command of his muskets from order arms to carry arms, and he saluted the Confederate soldiers. John Brown Gordon was overcome by this. In years later, he would call it simply a token of respect that Chamberlain offered to his men. Well, Chamberlain returns home. He's the hero of Little Round Top. He'll be that for the rest of his life. And now the Republican Party wants to know, could they nominate him for governor? Maine had a strange balloting process. The governorship lasted only 1 year. I checked it out, and the average governor served a year and a half. Chamberlain is now elected governor of Maine once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and finally steps down. Now, he is not leading the reconstruction that we are most familiar with. In fact, he says in his inaugural talk as governor that he wants to focus on saying there must be an industrial and financial as well as political reconstruction. It may be hard to remember, but in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of a strong central government, and the Democratic Party was the party of states' rights. And so Chamberlain is the part of a strong central government, and he wants to use that federal government, including the funding of the federal government, to enhance the railroads which must be taking place if Maine is ever to become a modern state. After 4 years as governor, he now is asked to serve as president of Bowdoin College. Looks a little better there as president of Bowdoin College. He gives an inaugural address. Colleges are faced with a very difficult future at the end of the Civil War. They've all been founded in the early 19th century, mostly by Protestant denominations. Many will not survive as the whole culture and the economy changes. And so he offers an address which he calls the New Education. In accepting the commission, and he uses that word, interestingly, to be president of Bowdoin College, he said something was desperately wrong. The times have shot past the college. Left out of the current of living sympathies, she stood still, while the world at full flood and flushed with new life swept on. He told his audience, I'm not sure they want to hear this, the college has touched bottom. He asked 2 questions: how to rise again. Well, the first question could be answered: we might confine our efforts chiefly to holding our own, strengthening the things that remain, and feel our way by cautious and imperceptible degrees. The second answer is, should the college conquer or should it die? So he presents a vision for a modern Bowdoin College. Now here's a person with a traditional Christian faith, but he's open to the fact that the world is changing quickly, and the world is changing quickly by the study of science. So he wants to put in place a full department of science. So the alumni, as alumni ever, wanted change, but they were not quite sure they wanted the change that Chamberlain offered. So in 2 years, Chamberlain resigns, and the board of trustees and the overseers refuse to accept his resignation. He believes that science is the way Bowdoin College can enter into the end of the 19th century. There's a lot of factors that take place there. The most important or innocuous story is he puts in place what 20 other colleges do, the idea that men now begin to drill, that men were caught off guard by the Civil War. They've now become soft after the Civil War. We need to have military preparation. This becomes a huge, huge fol-de-rol, and finally he has to stop this. Well, Chamberlain is now settling into his role as Bowdoin College president. And let me conclude with this story, which I think is the most remarkable story. I argue it's an even more important story than Little Round Top. We became accustomed in 2020 to a new event in American history. We thought that the peaceful transfer of power was simply a part of our American story. And then we were told that this had never happened before. Well, it had never happened before in a presidential election, but it had happened before. It happened in the state of Maine. What happened was that Republicans had controlled Maine for most of the years after the Civil War, but right before 1880, as Chamberlain is still the president of Bowdoin College, the Democrats had won the governorship, and now the election of 1879 takes place. And the Republicans appear to have won. They've won the governorship, they've won the House of Representatives, and they've won the state Senate of Maine. But the problem was the Maine Constitution. If the election goes down to 3 candidates, the House will select 2 and the Senate will select 1. And now it begins to have what's called the Great Countout. As the votes go forward, a Democratic state auditor says these votes don't count. In one town, 5 representatives and 1 senator lost their seats, the results not signed in an open town meeting. In another, 5 representatives were eliminated because the candidates' names were listed with initials, not full names. Votes in one Republican town were disqualified because the ballot was printed in 2 columns rather than 1. In another town, 2 representatives were counted out because of the misspelling of their names. In Lewiston, Saco, Bath, and Rockland, all the votes were dismissed because only three aldermen signed it instead of 4. Republican anger grew across the state. The conspiracy, revolution actually afoot, only awaiting the final act. Will they commit the monstrous crime? And so men begin marching to the capital of Maine, armed. The governor sends for ammunition and guns from the armory. The capital is surrounded by men. It looks like an insurrection is about to take place. They have stolen the election, the word goes out. What will the governor do? The Democratic governor calls upon Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, sitting quietly in his Bowdoin College office, to come to the Capitol. Major General Joshua L. Chamberlain is authorized and directed to protect the public property and institutions of the state until my successor is duly qualified. Duty called him once again. Chamberlain arrived on January 5, 1880. He found the State House barricaded with heavy wooded planks. He entered and established himself in a small office. In his first order, he dismissed the paramilitary force that was surrounding the Capitol. He sent the rifles and ammunition back to the armory in Bangor. He now became the military governor of the state. In his unanticipated position, he decided to keep clear of all civilian political decisions. He did not have the authority to figure out who was going to be the next governor. Everything is confusion here, he writes Fanny. Although I succeeded yesterday in getting a good many awkward things straightened out, what vexes me the most is that my own people, the Republicans, do not like to have me straighten things out. This confusion was captured in Frank Leslie's illustrated weekly magazine. 2 days later, he wrote Fanny again, I do not dare to leave here for a moment. There most assuredly would be a coup d'etat ending in violence and bloodshed. The rumors are out. He will be kidnapped, if not killed. Well, at this moment, I'm so glad that Portland, United States Congressman Thomas Reed offered this portrait of Chamberlain. At last we have peace, white-winged, beneficent, and headed by a major general. The resplendent figure shining like one of the suns of the morning, which has brought us this tranquil joy, is the figure of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, to whom Lee surrendered. He described Chamberlain as the one who walks the stairs, master of the situation. Although he thought of himself as the mediator, he was now being assailed from all sides, Republicans, Democrats, and what was called fusionists. With rumors afloat, the gossip was that he would be kidnapped. In a January 15 letter to Fanny, he confided to her of the bitter attack upon him in the Bangor commercial, calling him a traitor to the Republican cause. He even heard threats of her. If you were afraid, he told her to contact Thomas Eaton, a local police officer, to have the police keep an eye upon you and the house. One afternoon, the mayor of Augusta rushes in to tell Chamberlain that men are coming to the Capitol armed to the teeth. An insurrection is about to take place. Chamberlain steps out with the battle flags of Maine surrounding him, and this is what he says. Men, you wish to kill me, I hear. Killing is no new thing to me. I've offered myself to be killed many times when I no more deserved it than I do now. Some of you, I think, have been with me in those days. You understand what you want, do you? I'm here to preserve the peace and honor of this state until the right government is seated. Whatever it may be, it's not for me to say, but it is for me to see that the laws of this state are enacted with calm and sincere purpose. I'm here for that. and I shall do it. If anybody wants to kill me, here I am, let him kill. And as he said this, he opened his jacket and stepped forward to the crowd. Witnessing these events, Nelson Dingley, a former governor, wrote, "There was breathless silence for a moment. Then a veteran in the crowd called out, 'By God, old general, the first man that dares to lay a hand on you, I'll kill him on the spot.' And the crowd drifted away." I've come to believe that this was Chamberlain's finest moment. He wrote to Fanny the next day, this was another little round top. He'd given hundreds of speeches across Maine, in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, where people rose in standing with applause because he was the great orator after the Civil War. But now the crowd dispersed in silence. I think it was his finest speech. On January 16, the Maine Supreme Court offered its ruling. The Republicans won the governorship. The Republicans had won the House. The Republicans had won the Senate. I was amazed in tracking this story of the letters that came in from all across the country. L.T. Carleton, a lawyer in Winthrop, Maine, penned, "You have too long hidden yourself away from public gaze. Let me assure you that the old-time enthusiasm for you has not abated in the least." Chamberlain was gratified to receive letters from men of the 20th Maine. Ellis Spear, a veteran of the 20th Maine, wrote, "I laughed when I saw and heard the threats against you. The men who made them did not see you in the hellfire of Petersburg." Dennis Shapley, remembering his participation in the surrender at Appomattox. "General Chamberlain, we were never so proud of you as now, not even when you stood upon the boundary lines and received the surrender of our vanquished foe." I think I most appreciated the words of Helen Killam, a leader of the Women's Club movement of Massachusetts. She wrote, "We see it possible for a man to be a statesman, a soldier, a scholar, a gentleman, and a Christian." The 12 days in Augusta, as they're called, I think were Chamberlain's finest hour. Well, after his retirement from Bowdoin College, with no pension except a small military pension, nothing from being governor, nothing from being president of Bowdoin College, he believes he'll try his hand at business, and he goes to Florida. Southerners, especially in the newly developing state of Florida, were wanting northern men of stature to be at the top of a company. Not that they were the day-to-day manager, but they lended a certain stature to it. So Chamberlain worked in Florida. He had an office in Wall Street, and he was not successful. And after 10 years, his son Willis writes to Fanny and says, "I'm coming to realize better than ever what you have seen so long. Our man cannot be best at everything, and father cannot even be relied to look out for himself, but he always looks out for the other fellow." Despite his continuing infections, here he is as the grand old man of Maine in the early 20th century, riding in the parade in Portland, Maine. Well, perhaps the finest moment in some ways for Chamberlain took place right here at Gettysburg. In 1889, the men of the 20th Maine came back to dedicate the monuments to both Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And of all the great words that Chamberlain has offered, these may be the finest. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear. But spirits linger to consecrate the ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that know us not, and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and to dream. In conclusion, I have learned a lot from audiences. They have said to me, this is not simply a Civil War story. This is not simply a 19th century story. This is the story of the very values and the very kind of leaders we need today. I learned from my audience that Chamberlain has been taught at the United States Air Force Academy. Wow. Someone told me that leadership taught at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania lifts up Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain as a model of leadership. So may I conclude with this. At its heart, the biography of Chamberlain poses this question: what makes a leader? What background? What behavior? What beliefs? What circumstances? What records? What outcomes? At the end of this presentation, I turn that question over to you. Thank you very much.